Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Director Watch, an Awards Watch podcast that attempts to get inside the mind of cinema's greatest auteurs, explore what drives them, and maybe we go on a few unrelated tangents along the way. I'm Ryan McQuade, the executive editor here at Awards Watch, and joining me, as always, is my co-host, Jay Ledbetter.
Redford, Pitt, two of the greatest movie stars, a baton handoff of movie stardom on screen together for about 12 minutes. We're talking Spy Game. We're doing it. We're talking Spy Game. The Tony Scott series marches on. Spy Game. This is going to be an interesting one. Lots to talk about.
Yeah.
But good and bad.
Well, that was the thing. It's like usually with these intros, I'll throw something in there before I say your name. But I kind of felt like the minimal effort in just tossing it over to you, Jay, was appropriate for the minimal amount of effort that this movie does of putting these two ginormous movie stars together on screen. Yeah, this is going to be a complicated episode, but I feel like there's going to be a lot of tangents because it was kind of like the last episode when we talked about Enemy of the State. This is talking about big movie stars. And that's what Tony Scott is.
Meta elements to this.
Meta elements to this for sure. But we are not alone, Jay. You know,
we're guest heavy this week.
We're guest heavy this week. We got two guests. First time we've had two guests on the show ever. I wonder what their feelings are on Spy Game. But we have the wonderful podcast co-hosts over at the Extra Credits podcast, Kelsi and Trey, joining us here. Welcome to Director Watch, guys.
Thanks for having us on, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I like the take on Spy Game right away. That maybe this movie will be pretty complicated, and that we'll only be talking about Brad Pitt and Robert Redford in the same room for about 12 minutes today. I wanted to start off today by saying this might not even be the best spy movie of 2001, which might be Spy Kids.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah, Spy Kids also came out in 2001. I feel like it's similar font, but I don't know.
Odd timing.
Yeah, the titles.
Spy Kids came out in 2001?
I think so, yeah.
Jesus. Good Lord.
Big year, 2001.
That was the biggest spy movie in my life at that year.
You know what was funny? Tangent number one is when the sequel for Spy Kids came out, they did a contest here in town in San Antonio where it was over the radio, and
of course, Spy Kids 2: The Island of Lost Dreams. To be clear,
thank you very much. Sorry, Jay, I didn't. I meant to say the whole title, and I totally forgot it. Anyway, so it was like everybody could go to like this event location, right? And essentially, it was you and a parent, because it's like no two adults are going to go to this thing. You're going to take a kid, and we went to this event center at a Marriott. And they had us all in this ballroom, and they all gave us like envelopes with a key in it, right? And whichever key opened the door, you got a round trip ticket to the premiere of Spy Kids 2, and you get to meet the whole gang and everything.
Man.
So your consolation prize for the 50 other families that didn't get to go and do this was you got to sit in the ballroom on this small projected screen and watch the first one. To which my mom looked at me and said, "We could do this at home. We didn't win. Let's go." So
wow. Yeah, that's just a poor marketing decision.
I mean, if the thumbs were there, I would have made it work.
No cast members, no thumbs, no McDonald's that just gets made out of the microwave, which was truly like a revolutionary thing when you're a kid and you're like, "Wow, that's real," and your parents like, "Nope, that's a movie." So
incredible.
Yeah, it's the power of cinema.
Power of cinema, indeed. I'm trying to look and see if
is this turning into a Spy Kids episode.
Well, you know what, Jay?
Yeah.
Spy Kids, directed by Tony Scott.
Has anybody seen the Spy Kids movie that came out last year?
I have not.
What?
It's on
That's
Netflix.
Rodriguez too, right?
Did he direct that?
I think he did.
Spy Kids Armageddon, directed in fact by Robert Rodriguez.
Yeah.
Yeah, Robert Rodriguez doing great.
I actually saw him at an event a couple weeks ago because he introduced Glenn Powell into the Texas Movie Hall of Fame before the premiere of Hitman in Austin.
Glenn Powell was in one of the Spy Kids.
Well, yeah, he was in Spy Kids 3D. Yeah, and
3D Game Over. Right?
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you very
there
much,
you go.
Jay, for getting the correct title again. But yeah, I assume in between, whatever the hell he's doing, he had free time on his hands to go out there and do that.
Hypnotic also came out that year.
Oh God, is that the Ben Affleck movie?
Yeah, that one was something.
Did you guys see Hypnotic?
I didn't. No.
No, Kelsey, you didn't put on
No.
Hypnotic. Okay.
Can I tell
Will
you?
Yeah.
Don't.
Okay.
Don't do it. Like, it was one of those. I remember it was see that or watch the 2022, 2023 Oscars, and I obviously I had to watch the Oscars and I made a good choice. And then this year it was watch the Oscars or watch I Saw the TV Glow at South by. And now next year I don't have to worry about that because they're going to have the Oscars a week ahead. So
Which is nice. Yeah.
it's really nice because I'm sick and tired of having to pick and choose. But anyway,
Happy for you,
beside,
Ryan.
it's the little victories in life.
You know who
but
would have directed Great Hypnotic? Tony Scott would have done a phenomenal job.
he could have done every good movie, man. Like, if
We were
there's-
talking about
there's
it
not-
last week. Like, what if Tony Scott was able to direct the Equalizer series?
Man.
Like, it just incredible.
I'm just thinking about all the low rent
Denzel run.
action movies that have come out, and I'm just thinking about, like, how could that be elevated by a genius?
What
But
if
that's
Tony Scott got a stab at Spy Kids Armageddon?
What's
Who
the
knows?
Hemsworth movie? Is it Extraction? Is that?
Whoa, you're talking to the
wow.
extraction defender here.
Yeah. So
that would be
I'm-
interesting.
I'm a fan. That he would be interesting in that space.
Well,
In in Extraction 2, a man gets his head exploded by leg press. It is a great scene.
I haven't
Is
seen
it-
the sequel.
so real date night movies. Anyway, we're here to talk about Spy Game. All those tangents aside, Kelsi, Trey, we brought you on to talk about this complicated but yet important film, I think, in Tony Scott's filmography. But before we get into the film and talking about that, I'm curious for both of y'all where Tony Scott kind of sits for you as a director, what you like about him, what you don't like about him. And then I'm going to ask you a question that I've asked every single other guest that's been on this podcast so far for this series. If you can only pick one, and you can only pick one filmography, which would you pick? Would you pick the Riddler in Ridley Scott, or would you pick the tone setter in Tony Scott? Which one would you pick?
So first question is our relationship to Tony Scott. So Tony Scott rules.
Yeah.
I remember being 10 years old, sitting on my living room floor, eyes wide open, locked in, not knowing what director I was watching for the movie I was watching. But I remember now looking back at it, just totally being hypnotized by his like hyper stylized action thrillers. And that's what I remember most about Tony Scott is I remember watching Denzel Washington or Will Smith or Brad Pitt or Tom Cruise running from some explosion or flying away from it in the air and just being kind of wowed and thinking, is this the most exciting movie I've ever seen in my entire life? And he has that kind of power. And he has that kind of power on cable networks specifically. I remember in my youth thinking, oh, Tony Scott is the TNT filmmaker.
Yeah.
He makes some of the
King.
most, yeah, truly, he makes some of the most rewatchable movies of all time. But he's maybe the first filmmaker that I had an awareness that I completed his filmography without realizing it. I did not, even prepping for today's episode, I thought I'd have to, watch a few movies that I missed out on in my childhood, but I had seen everything. And that's just because of being just taken by his movies at a really young age. I think the first Scott movie I ever watched was probably Crimson Tide, which might even be his best movie. And so I've always had like a really positive relationship to him. He's just one of the most exciting and anxiety-inducing filmmakers with some of the craziest zoom-ins, which I'm sure we'll talk about
Yeah.
in Spy Game today, and doing dolly
Chill
zooms for no
editing.
reason in the middle of an office, which is fun. So he's awesome.
Yeah. No, I love that you're talking about him as like a TNT director, because I think that, when we think of like movies that go straight to streaming, they're not as exciting as the TNT reruns, that like a Tony Scott would be putting out.
That's a great point.
And he, like all the things that you said about his stylistic choices, like he's very heightened. very plot within a plot, something that people love about like a Christopher Nolan, right? Today, or even like people talk about Michael Mann in terms of like the stylistic choices. If I'm thinking of like certain scenes in Manhunter that are, have that kind of like strobe light effect. He's a very big on, the
big vibe guy,
flashing cities in jagged edits. I always like associate him with his style first. And of course I always associate him as like a Scott, right, brother.
Yeah.
And so I think, we probably feel the same about your second question, which is we are, well, I don't want to speak for you, so I'll speak for me first, but I am Ridley Scott 1000%.
Yeah.
Okay. We've covered a lot of movies on our podcast on Ridley, and he's one of my favorite directors, even though I love Tony Scott and like respect his whole filmography. But I think it's fascinating to look at how they are different. Like for me, Ridley Scott is really interested in kind of like addressing concepts or we both have an unpopular opinion of loving Prometheus. But I think Ridley Scott really tackles like religion and power and like fragile masculinity, even in like Gladiator, and that's why I come back to Ridley's films and love them so much. Also stylistically,
Tony does too, just in different ways.
He does. Yeah. We'll talk about it too with Spy Game, I think, today.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think for me, it's definitely Ridley in my heart.
Yeah. I mean, they are both incredibly unsettled filmmakers.
Yeah.
Like they are very politically messy and they are very exciting. No concept is too big for them to have in the periphery or in the forefront. And I am always just excited to throw on a Ridley Scott or Tony Scott movie. Does Ridley Scott, is he a little bit more prolific and that isn't always helping him? Absolutely. And he does have a long list of films that I don't really want to watch a second time. I'm looking at you, Exodus, Gods of Kings, or that one Christopher Columbus movie. But ultimately,
classic
stuff. And I just think that the first, the top 6 or 7 Ridley Scott movies for me are just kind of like 4.5, 5-star films. And even though I love Tony Scott, he has made some of the most rewatchable movies of all time and is one of the great action thriller directors. He has, I think, Ryan, you said in one of your episodes that I listened to that he has a great batting average. And I think that's kind of, I think that defines his work. He's a ton of 4-star movies. And I love coming back to them for that reason. I just think with Ridley, there's more upside, and the upside is substantial, right? And I think of Ridley Scott when I think of Scorsese and Spielberg or James Cameron or George Miller. And maybe if Tony was with us for longer, I would think of him in that similar tier. But ultimately, I think Tony Scott is somewhere closer to, and this is, again, what Kelsi was saying, this is a great compliment to someone like today, maybe like a Christopher Nolan. Like, I don't know if Nolan would exist today if it wasn't for what Tony Scott did. And I don't think Nolan would exist if it was, like you said, like Michael Mann, what he did and still doing. So, yeah, I love Tony for a variety of reasons, and his movies are hypnotic in really exciting ways. But ultimately, just the highs for me are too big. I have a Nostromo sweater.
Yeah, I was about to say, Ryan.
I'm repping Alien.
The writing was on the wall.
I know. That's why I told him ahead of time. I was like, I think I know where they're leaning, but it's still, nonetheless, you have to ask the question because you could always surprise yourself. I do want to pat myself, I guess, on the back because Trey brought up that I brought up a good point on a couple episodes back or something about batting average. Ryan. Oh, I guess it goes back to like Ridley is a home run hitter, if you're going to use the baseball analogy, because like with home run sluggers, they have these, they swing for power, so they can hit home runs out of the park, but then they also strike out a lot, like an Aaron Judge. You know what I mean?
Analytics favor Ridley. Talking about some
exactly, but well, no, they kind of don't. Analytics about getting on base.
Love
they love
current baseball
Tony, right?
philosophy, and this is the only sports thing I will say this episode.
No,
the current baseball philosophy is home runs are the best, and strikeouts don't matter. So just hit home runs.
Well,
and Ridley Scott has some strikeouts.
I was going to say because I'm like
Moneyball podcast.
Well, no, because like I mean.
The movie ball.
I believe more in the if you get on base and you get runs, that's what matters. And
how many World Series did the Athletics win?
Well,
The
yeah,
answer
but
is
the Reds, yeah, but my Red Sox adopted that literally like the next year or whatever, and then they won the whole World Series and broke the curse of Bambino.
And that's
so-
been Sports Watch.
and that's
On to
been Sports
Spy
Watch,
Game.
yeah. So Spy Game,
What
but
if Tony Scott directed Moneyball?
gosh,
That'd be another great one.
Would have been
well,
good.
I mean, he did work technically with Sorkin before on a little bit of the punch up for Enemy of the State, so it wouldn't
It's true.
be the worst thing. And we all know Aaron Sorkin with another director using his work is always better than what Aaron Sorkin does as a writer.
You didn't like being those Ricardos?
Did you almost say meet the Ricardos?
I did. I almost said meet the Ricardos, but we didn't just meet them. We were.
We
them.
were them. We engulfed their presence and their on those terrible performances. Anyway, no, I love that though, because yes, I mean that is the dilemma about Ridley is that he's got two of the greatest movies of all time in the middle of those.
Yeah.
Like
I am-
canonical classics.
But
just
he's also he's got movies that are. I'm looking at this right now. I mean, he's got Alien, he's got Blade Runner. But even if we take those out, like I think The Last Duel is one of the most impressive movies of the 2020s that nobody saw
Yeah.
because of the
I
pandemic.
agree.
And Thelma and Louise is not a movie
yeah.
you would see
Banger.
in a director like his in his filmography. Kingdom of Heaven, like the legendary director's cut aside, like a really complex movie.
Jay's a big defender of The Counselor, which is
I'm a
Yes.
counselor boy myself.
Yeah.
And
so like, even people who are down on Ridley's past decade, I don't know. I mean, we're going to have a really cool guest on soon in September around that time to do a Ridley Scott filmography deep dive. And we are going to be rewatching
nice.
his whole entire filmography pretty soon. And we were looking at the past 10, 15 years that a lot of people have looked at as kind of lesser than Ridley. But I think he's just made some really good bangers that are kind of underrated at this point. Like even people revisiting Alien Covenant, I think with the new Alien film coming out soon are kind of going to realize, oh, he made like a horror Alien movie. Like it's nothing like Prometheus, which is like way more heady.
I like
It
Covenant
takes its
more than
time.
Prometheus.
Yeah, that's totally
my
fair.
take.
Yeah.
I haven't
So
seen
he just has a
I haven't
really
seen
diverse
Covenant.
filmography.
I missed
Yeah,
out
it's
on
good.
Covenant. I need to watch it. No, I mean, yes, I mean, it is easy to sort of dog on him, but I think the thing that we can all agree on is that they both make movies. It would be really interesting to see what Tony would be making nowadays because his brother is making movies that, like Jay has pointed out in the past, won't probably exist after he's gone. And other directors have tried to sort of duplicate like the Anton Fuquas of the world or other directors that are making these, like, you know, I think of what was that movie that the Russo brothers did with Ryan Gosling?
The Gray Man?
The Gray Man. That feels like Tony Scott kind of adjacent sort of stuff, but it doesn't have any, but it's terrible. You know what I mean?
Identity.
It has no identity. It's just terrible movie
Yeah.
in general. And made by like directors are like, I guess we got a blank check from Netflix.
Remember Cherry?
Yeah, exactly.
That was
Another movie
wild.
where you're just like, these guys are making probably movies that he would, but it would be interesting. Does he pivot? Does he make, you know, I mean, like his last movie, Unstoppable, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, is such, it feels like such a great send off to him, but it also is just like, this guy still got the juice. He's making a movie about a train, feel more propulsive than any Marvel movie has ever felt.
Choo-choo.
And you're like, what in the hell? Like, can we get more of these, please? And then sadly he passes away. But
I will
you know,
say y'all are only the second and third of our 9 guests to go Ridley.
yeah, that is the other thing too.
Interestingly. Yeah.
And we,
Yeah.
I mean, it probably helps that they're coming on to discuss Tony Scott.
Sure.
it does,
but-
but it is a question that, you know, it has divided people.
Yeah, I think that the Tony Scott question is a really good one of what he would be doing today, because obviously I think a lot of people think of Doug Liman. I think there's a lot of crossover there.
Oh
I think
man, the
Christopher
lineman of it all.
McQuarrie,
Yeah, Macquarie.
Chad Stahelski right now is blowing up. Antoine Fuqua seems like, and Michael Bay seem like the directors who've kind of run
David
with the Tony
Leitch.
Scott film
Yeah.
since. Leach for sure. I think what's unfortunate about Tony Scott's work is that studios were like, we're not going to do these convoluted plots with all this political messiness in the periphery and these character studies in the forefront in movies anymore. We're too afraid of them losing money. Also, Tony Scott, you wanted a $110 million spy game movie. We can't do that anymore. So a lot of Tony Scott movies and things he would be interested in today have just moved to television and streaming, and they look bad. They don't have the same kind of, I think the problem there is if you make a Tony Scott movie that is elongated over 7 episodes and make it 6-7 hours, it's kind of ruined, because a lot of what he's doing is about creating this propulsive electric energy. And when you make that a TV series or some kind of like HBO series or Apple Plus, whatever, it's just not going to be as effective and not have that atmosphere and energy you want to come back to.
Which is so wild, because like we were watching Man on Fire for this episode and just rewatching a lot of Tony Scott movies, and we were like, this actually one would be great as a series though. Yeah, and it was just announced, right? Like
yesterday, but
it's our influence. It's our influence, Jay. Look at him
driving culture.
Flex is listening to us. With
the Creasy series.
Yeah, the Creasy series.
Yahya Abdul-Mateen, right?
Yeah.
And I think the writer of the screenwriter of Spy Game just came out with a series of novels that they're hoping to make into television shows or movies that are going to be focusing on both the lead characters in this movie. So I think that's unfortunately what's happened. I do think this will probably be in cycles and we'll get a return, hopefully. Like something like Challengers blowing up this year that isn't Tony Scott coded, but it's also not Scott coded in terms of how it moves. And I think maybe not people not really caring as much about the ideas or the character studies totally working, and more wanting to feel the atmosphere in the theater experience. And if we can get like low to mid budget, relatively like 20 to 40, 20 to $50 million movie made that are action thrillers, I think they could do well.
Yeah, I just think that when you're talking about like television shows, like a Man on Fire television show, because it has multiple books and everything, that sounds great and everything, but it won't have it'll struggle in having to settle in on its tone early on, or try to find its energy. Like that's even like the thing that kind of frustrated me with the Ripley series that is on Netflix, is because when you watch The Talented Mr. Ripley as a film, that has such a pace and an energy and a fluidity of sexuality and all this stuff. So then when you slow it down, you take all the color out, and it's still beautiful. Like that show, it's a totally different exercise. But when you're accustomed to what this property is, and then you're getting something else, a lot of people push back on that. So like, it will be interesting when that show comes out, because it's not going to look like Man on Fire at all, because it's not going to have nothing does, to be honest. And that's like even the thing about a movie like Spy Game, which is what we're here to talk about, is this doesn't look like your sort of garden variety, like a mentor mentee CIA kind of recruitment sort of film. And yet that's there. I mean, while it looks great, there's also maybe script problems, and there's other things that get in its way from being what Jay has told me off camera as why isn't this movie great? So I think I don't understand why this movie isn't a masterpiece. So I think that's the good way to jump into Spy Game here.
Let's do it.
Which is I guess the first question for you guys is like, what do you think of this movie? Was this a first? I don't know if this was a first time watch for either one of you, or how long it's been since you guys seen it, but what do you think of it, and do you guys think that it's a missed opportunity? Because spoiler alert, I kind of think it is.
Yeah, I saw this really young. Like I said, I watched this whole filmography kind of in my teenage years, and I haven't come back to this in over a decade. Just got on Blu-ray recently to check out the special features and the commentaries. I had ultimately an overall good experience, though complicated, in rewatching this movie a few times now. And this film kind of feels like a coked up parallax view in moments where I'm like, let's go. Like, I'm excited for this. This is insane. And then the cinematography and the editing go to like a Mission Impossible, like an early Mission Impossible kind of film that I'm sort of in on, sort of out on, like a John Woo style filmmaking. And then you also just notice Robert Redford and Brad Pitt in wigs way too much.
Yeah, the wigs are wild.
What's going on here? And the bad guys are really in the boardroom, but then there's some Orientalism going on, some xenophobia, and you're like, okay, how aware are the politics of this movie? Just because it's provoking us with this kind of generational angst between the Redford and Pitt characters, while also having the McCormack character, the love interest in the periphery of the story that clearly was going to be a bigger part of the narrative, but then they kind of removed that. So it's a messy movie. I do think ultimately it works for me. I think it is a good movie. But there are things today that this is a weird one where I would love to see kind of a remake or something close to this as a film today with some touch-ups on the screenplay, obviously, and changing some things. Because ultimately, I do think Tony Scott's intentions of taking us over these different eras of American interventionism during the Cold War is fascinating. And maybe him and Ridley Scott aren't the best filmmakers to do something like that because they are such politically provocative and also questionable filmmakers in certain movies. Like Black Hawk Down came out in 2001, which has its own set of problems, or Body of Lies in the future for Ridley as well. So they both have issues in that arena that they are observing patterns really well. And this movie almost feels like a cautionary tale for what is to come in the kind of post 9/11 Western imperialism world. But I'm not forgiving it for messing up in those political places, but I do ultimately think it comes out as a pretty good movie.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's one of those movies that, well, so my relationship to Tony Scott is more so like Man on Fire, Crimson Tide, Deja Vu, Top Gun, obviously.
Yeah.
And so I had seen pieces of Spy Game, but I don't think I had really like sat down and watched it all the way through until we were coming on for this episode. So I have a pretty like fresh take on it from seeing his, also like what he's done in his other movies that are usually like politically messy and still politically messy in this movie. But it was interesting to me in this movie in particular, like he was actually trying to, in ways like directly address an older generation of a Robert Redford and talk about like the U.S. involvement and talk about like the messed up like barometer of success. So I was actually surprised that in this movie versus other movies, there were actually some interesting ideas, I guess, within a really huge like action movie. But it did feel like there were a bunch of different movies in this movie, right? Like at one point, I guess I was listening to the director's commentary this morning, and Tony Scott was saying that they kind of took that montage of Brad Pitt and Robert Redford and spaced it out throughout the whole movie and felt like the pacing was just off. So they decided to put it in like a montage, which I love.
The training sequence?
The training montage. Yeah. I love Robert Redford.
Because Robert Redford and Brad Pitt are on screen together.
And
That's awesome.
And they're flirting, it's great. Like,
there's chemistry.
And also, it's so funny that you said challengers, because it reminds me of that Atticus Ross, like Trent Reznor kind of score.
There's an electric score going on when they get away from
guitar or whatever it
being
is.
in Lebanon doing whatever they're doing there.
Yeah.
With the score,
But yeah, so I ultimately think like it's a good movie. I don't think it's great. I don't know when I will like rewatch it. But I think that has to do with a lot of different things going on in the movie. I rewatched it and finally kind of got the plot, I think, like
that's hilarious. Just thinking about like having to define what the plot is of any Tony Scott film is like almost impossible. It is a mission impossible, literally.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of them are more straightforward, like Unstoppable.
Yeah,
stopping train.
That's true.
But
do you stop a train? Well, it seems pretty unstoppable.
I think this is the era where they get convoluted. It's like enemy of the state to like
deja vu. Like explain deja vu in 2 sentences.
Yes.
I love how Deja Vu is his sci-fi movie, though.
But it's also like
Ridley.
I don't know how that movie was successful because it's like if
sci-fi.
I walked up to somebody on the street, it'd be like, I just saw Deja Vu, and they'd be like, oh, what's that about? And I'd be like, how much time do you have?
Have you seen Tenet?
The characters can't explain it either in Deja Vu. So.
Can I write like can I use this whiteboard to explain it to you? Like it's very Tenet almost at times. It's like how you're trying to explain it, but no. But yeah, Jay.
Yes.
How do you feel about Spy Game?
Yeah, Spy Game. As far as my relationship of it is concerned, I saw it for the first time a few years ago when I did my first kind of Tony Scott. Gonna make sure that I've seen all of these dive, and you see the tantalizing idea of this movie on paper, right? It's the passing of the torch, Redford to Pitt. Pitt is kind of at close to the peak of his stardom here. Redford has been on a bit of a heater between directing and, starring in his own films and still kind of being this great prestige performer. And that just sounds awesome. These two guys on screen have a pitter patter, rat-a-tat dialogue with this incredible pacing from Tony Scott. And I watched this movie, and like you said, Ryan, I'm like, why isn't this a masterpiece? And I think I'm probably going to sound more negative than I actually feel about this movie.
I feel it coming
I just
on.
want it to be better.
Yeah.
But I do think this movie is pretty good. I maintain that Tony Scott has never made a bad movie. But this is, in my opinion, one of his worst movies. So just remember, mark it down right now. I think this movie is good. But I'm going to try to maintain a positive lens in that regard and try to not point out as many of the negatives. But I'll start off by saying just this is not nearly as propulsive as Tony Scott's best stuff. This is a film that mostly takes place in boardrooms, but doesn't have that really biting dialogue in a movie that is loaded with this cynicism when it comes to American institutions and government organizations. But it's also kind of about this guy, Robert Redford's character, making penance for his actions in the past and realizing that his ability to sacrifice civilians at will is sort of coming to a head here. And he's realizing on the day of his retirement that, maybe there's something very wrong with what I've done in the past. And maybe this young guy who I trained and sort of abandoned this philosophy that I had is sort of on a better track than I am. However, the whole reason that Pitt is doing everything that he's doing here, going to this prison to try and save the woman he loves, there is next to no romance in this film. It is truly like two scenes there's one scene where they're having lunch together, and the purpose of that entire scene is trying to throw Redford off the scent, throw Muir off the scent of them being together and him kind of being manipulated by her in some way or another. And then the other scene is just them walking out of some hotel. It's implied that they hooked up the night before, and it's implied that the connection is pretty strong at that point. But there's just no electricity to that relationship whatsoever. Not because they're not charismatic performers, but because they're not given the opportunity to be charismatic together. I mean, we're talking about one of the greatest movie stars of all time, and there's alarmingly little Pitt in this movie in general. And I do think he's very good. I love anytime you see him in that San Diego Padres hat. I don't know why. Just interesting to me that he's wearing that hat. But I just wish there was more Redford and Pitt, and just Pitt in general, and locations in general. This is Tony Scott's most expensive movie, $115 million budget. And they use so many locations, but it feels like they're in a boardroom for 75% of the movie. And I'm not sure if that is accurate or not, but that's in my memory how this movie feels. And when you're on location and you're getting some of these action sequences, the scene where they're going to assassinate the sheikh is incredibly visceral. Like, I think so effective. And the production of this film was like verging on a nightmare, the way that they went to Tel Aviv to film the movie, but there was some violence going on in Tel Aviv. They had Molotov cocktails thrown on the set. It was a mess. And so they decided to go to Casablanca to film, go to Morocco to film most of this film. And, they're duplicating sets. And I'm this does not, to me, feel like a $115 million movie in 2001, weirdly. It's a film I like, and we'll talk more about the stuff that I do like about it. But for me, it is one of the weaker Tony Scott films. And I just don't understand why it's not great.
So Jay, I'm gonna ask you something, and you can give me just a ballpark figure of what you think this movie cost. So this past weekend, spoiler alerts, kids out there, for if anyone's looking on my letterbox and when we're recording this movie for the show, I went and saw Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, which comes out the same year as this movie, literally a month apart in theaters almost, right? Like this was in November and Lord of the Rings was in December. Jay, how much do you think Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, that movie cost?
This is not, in my opinion, an entirely fair comparison because
not.
they don't star Robert Redford and Brad Pitt.
No, but
I'm going to say 85 million.
Ooh, you're a little low. $93 million.
That was a pretty decent guess.
For like it was pretty good. For like a 3-hour epic, right?
Yeah.
So when I thought of this movie, because I seen this when I was really young and I rewatched this, I think in the best way you should watch this movie. On a plane last year. Because this is the ultimate plane movie. I'll get to whether that's a good thing or not.
I don't know that any Tony Scott film is a great plane movie.
Action movies are great on a plane. They are like the number one thing. Like when I travel,
I did watch Blade last time.
What are you talking about? You just watched the first Blade.
I'm nothing if not a hypocrite.
There you go. Just walk it back from 15 seconds ago. So I thought when I was watching this movie, I'm like, oh man, this movie doesn't 100% work, in what it's trying to do or what it's trying to say, or just within the basic setup of this is Redford and Pitt baton passing moment, right? Because if you think of like the great baton passing moments, I always think of like The Color of Money, which is like mid-tier Scorsese, right? But as an exercise for Newman and Cruise and what was the past of great movie star and what is going to be the future of great movie star, it is like what you kind of want. And like for
also mid-tier Scorsese is still a damn good movie.
It's still a damn good movie. Mm-hmm. And that movie, really? I love that.
It is.
I mean, that's great. Like I love that movie and it's kind of underrated. I don't think people talk about it enough, but from that aspect, it is probably the most important aspect about this is that it is an examination really of the past and the future of movies. And that's what Scorsese has always got on the mind. And so you think, okay, well, this is what this is supposed to be. And I think when I saw the film, I was like, oh, that budget's probably like 65 million. When I saw it was 150 million for the first time 3 weeks ago, I went, now I understand why movies struggle, because I don't understand how this movie is. I understand that they had to be on location, and I understand maybe certain budgets or whatnot and certain aspects. But this movie, yeah, it feels like a $50 million movie. Things could have been cut back, especially for what you get. This is a movie of for an audience, I'm not getting what I thought I was going to get. And even for Tony Scott, I don't know what he's trying to say. It's kind of confusing on that. And then the Redford and Pitt of it all, it's like, it feels like Robert Redford is reluctantly giving over the reins of a movie star to Brad Pitt here. Yeah. It's like, you can be in this movie. I'll be your mentor, but you're only going to be in about 15 minutes or 20 minutes. It's going to mostly be me doing all the cool stuff. And it's going to center all around me in my decision making. And the other thing about it is if you look in Redford's relationship with just cinema in general, the paranoid thriller, the spy thriller is a big part of his 70s run. You're thinking of like 3 Days of Condor, you're thinking of like All the President's Men, you're thinking of these movies that also like then he starts making like Alliance for Lambs or the Company We Keep as a director later on in his career. He's very fascinated with politics and political thrillers. It's sort of what he is still invested in as a filmmaker. And this movie just doesn't feel like there's any sense of urgency in what it's trying to say, what it's trying to do, other than just being about one man's, like you said, Jay, sins of his past, catching up to him, and really reflecting on this trainee turn, by Brad Pitt, who just gets a really bad shake because he's like, oh, well, yeah, everything I told you is kind of wrong about all this. And there's also no romance, not just between Pitt and McCormack in this movie. There's no romance in the job itself. Movies like these, there is a romance to selling being a spy or being in this field, or there is a complete ugliness on the other side of it too, about how this is dirty and how from the get-go, if this is what you want to be, you know that there's no turning back. This movie tries to have its cake and eat it too, try to be in the middle way too much. And I don't particularly think that it's well shot. I don't think that
I think it's well shot.
I don't think so.
It's a Tony Scott movie.
That doesn't always have to mean anything. Just when you put that on there, it doesn't have. I mean, like I said that just because Ridley Scott makes a movie doesn't mean it looks good either. Like there are some of his movies that I go like, this should be impressive. This should be a technical marvel. This should make sense for all the different things that it's doing, and it just feels like
a helicopter shot when they're on the roof. That's elite stuff.
One shot does not make a 2-hour movie for me. Sorry, it just doesn't. And again, it's a wasted opportunity from two people that are very much like this is supposed to be the movie of this year where you're just like, God, we got two all-time greats in a movie. Let's frickin' go. And we're watching this over and over again. We would be more positive, all four of us, about this from this moment right now, if this movie sold the poster of this movie, which I actually think is a great poster. And you're like, yeah, it's got these two, it's play by their game and he plays you and all that kind of stuff. And you're like, oh, wow, that's like a great poster. Let me go see that movie. And you're like, oh, yeah, it's just a long version of people talking in a boardroom and him under an investigation and having to like, it spends more time in what feels like the leftovers of the Central Intelligence Building set pieces from Enemy of the State more than it actually sets up its own locations in this one too, or makes it interesting there. So it kind of feels like he's treading water that he's already gone into before. And even like the relationship dynamics between, like, dare I say this, and Jay's probably going to get mad at me, but like the relationship between Duvall and Cruz, like that mentor-mentee, that sort of against the ropes coming, in Days of Thunder, that works better for me there. Hackman and Smith, Hackman and Denzel, those are when you have these superstars,
on screen together.
Yeah, they're on screen together. So why take that away, which is such a big tool for him here. So, yeah, it's not a bad movie. It's just really disappointing. It really is, from just a general exercise.
Yeah, well, I feel like, there are movies that do the kind of deposition or from a boardroom storytelling really well. Like, Social Network, Fincher does this great. Even in Gone Girl, it's told in a lot of memories. But Jay, to what you were talking about earlier, right, it kind of lacks the propulsion in some of the flashbacks, or it feels like we're in some of the flashbacks for longer than others. I do think he does a good job of creating a different space in each flashback, like even with the technical choices that
they do the traffic thing, giving everything a little filter.
Yeah.
Little yellow here, a little gray here,
Yeah.
Early 2000s, late 90s thing.
Yeah. But I think, Ryan, what you were saying, that it's interesting that there should be more scenes where Pitt and Redford have more chemistry, right? Like I think I in the training montage, they have that for me. And that's why I really like that montage, but it feels kind of out of place in the movie because you think of maybe the biggest scene where they have their like pre-breakup and then breakup on the like before they get on the plane. But when they're on top of that roof and Brad Pitt throws that chair, I love how they have 3 chairs there just for him to throw one off a like tall building.
Yeah.
But
he's over here talking about not having civilian casualties and he's throwing chairs off buildings.
Exactly.
Come on, Bishop.
But he, when he delivers that line, like this isn't a game, it feels like they are doing a rehearsal for that scene. And it's so strange that they're so charismatic as individuals, but for whatever reason, the performances in certain scenes, they don't have that chemistry together. And Tony Scott was talking about, or one of the producers was saying, I love Robert Redford because he looks like he always is keeping a secret. And I think that the flip side of that, why Brad Pitt is so special as an actor as well, is that he looks like he's always about to tell you a secret. And they never capture that kind of like playfulness, except for a few scenes, like the breakfast. There are some exceptions. And I think that's also a piece where you're like, you have such high expectations going into the movie, and it feels like there aren't enough. They're not keeping the momentum or kind of dynamics between them that are fun.
Not enough Brad Pitt eating in this movie.
True.
If you're gonna have him and pay $25
Use that
million
jawline.
to have him,
He
in
drinks
this
a
film,
beer.
yeah, give him an apple or something. I don't know, but I agree with mostly everything that's been said from you guys. I'd be fascinated to know if they considered a director's cut, because I think what this movie struggles with ultimately is just the geopolitical nightmare that is the year 2000 when this was being made. And I think there are just a lot of conflicting opinions about how to make this movie, not just from an emotional perspective and the romances of it all, but also just like how do we go in and out of these places without totally exploiting the people in the periphery, while also telling a story about the guys in the boardroom that you're with being the guys who maybe are inciting incidents across the world.
Well, Trey, how do you release this movie 2 months, 2 or so-ish months after 9/11? And then it completely
They
takes
wanted him to push it back, and Scott was like, "No."
No.
And so was Ridley. Ridley was like, "I'm releasing Black Hawk Down. I don't care what you say."
Yeah, they both
Black Hawk Down
released.
kind of has this. The coldness of Black Hawk Down, I think, is kind of what makes that movie powerful, especially in the shadow of 9/11.
Yeah,
and this film sort of lacks that political potency. I think it has sort of a.
It has an indifference to it.
Not the powerful indifference that Black Hawk Down has, where it's presented as sort of this like documentary style. There is this idea of having to detach yourself from the events that are going on. In this film, instead, it's sort of like Tony Scott seems to be just sort of searching for something to latch on to thematically, and I don't think he ever really grabs that outside of maybe some character stuff. But as far as this film that is this globe-trotting political thriller, he forgets to attach the politics and perhaps some of the thrills to a certain extent, and makes it character-based but doesn't fully flesh out those characters.
I in terms of good things, and then I'm going to touch on the maybe why the political provocations are, I think there's an attempt to make them successful in an interesting way that they ultimately cut from the movie. I think there is an obvious 2.5 hour movie here where they just cut out subplots, but I actually like the in and out of the boardroom in different moments of the film, because I like the kind of back and forth between Redford and the other guys, and I'm forgetting the kind of key foil to him in the boardroom, that actor's name.
Oh, like Stephen Delaney. Yeah.
Delaney. Yeah, thank you. I like those aspects. I like that dynamic. I like that this movie takes place in one day, 24 hours, basically. I like that it's very dramatic about its internal clock. I like the corny and cheesy time passing, and you're cutting to black and white with a literal clock showing up on screen.
Yeah. It's like random numbers too. 12-12.
I love that stuff. We don't do that
Very
anymore.
24.
Yes, and I do love the random zooms. I love the dolly zooms at any given point in the movie. I think that's just funny, and even in insignificant scenes, I'm just kind of glued in certain moments. But again, like what we're talking about, and seeing this movie kind of talk about American interventionism or Western interventionism during the Cold War, going into the 90s, through these multiple set pieces of going from Vietnam to Germany to Lebanon, with that very big key set piece in Beirut for most of the end of the film. That stuff is in Tony Scott fashion and Ridley Scott fashion. But that greater political provocation, the reason I think a lot of us feel uncomplicated about that, and we're all kind of nailing the same thing, it just feels unfocused. And he spends so much of his attention on trying to get these two lead characters back to each other instead of just having us with them the entire time. You almost wanted to just follow Brad Pitt from a young age, and then seeing him get trained. Like what's that movie with Colin Farrell where he's training as an FBI agent?
The Recruit?
Yes, something that's
the fact
not a
that I
totally
pulled that
successful
out.
movie, but good job. But something closer to that, right? And get us that kind of Colin Farrell, Al Pacino energy, but put it in a Tony Scott's hands and see what he can do with that. But instead, this movie kind of, unfortunately, lives and dies by this mentor-mentee romance, because that's kind of what's going on. Brad Pitt's in love with himself. Robert Redford's in love with himself. And you're having these guys who are so self-interested kind of talk to one another. And it doesn't totally work chemistry-wise because they're both trying to kind of do their own thing. And I don't think they're the best collaborative actors. And so, yeah, I'm not sure they ever totally nail their relationship, though there is a generational angst that I do find kind of compelling.
I think that I think Redford and Pitt have shown that they can be part of iconic duos or iconic groups in cinema. You know what I mean? I mean, Redford is notorious. I mean, obviously his stuff with Newman, All the President's Men, that works because of Hoffman and because of Redford together. You look at literally in this year, Brad Pitt is in Ocean's 11, which is a movie that understands fundamentally how to use movie stars and use that charisma, and
it is simply the most entertaining film.
It's one of the most entertaining movies of all time.
It is.
You know what I mean?
11 and
then,
12.
You know, I even
Agreed.
think 13's good. Like, I think people
All right, let's do it.
I mean, like, I think people just have like because we put so much love.
I mean, it's
on
Ocean's 11 again.
Yeah,
which
I
is
mean,
good,
which is
but
never a
it's
bad
not Ocean's
thing.
11.
Yeah.
No, but you have Pacino in it. Hooah. And I and then I mean with Pitt, I mean, again, I think the other problem is this was the problem that I had watching it on the plane. So this is why I needed to rewatch it. It didn't help that like on the flight to where I was going, I watched Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and on the flight back, I watched this because this is like what to do with Brad Pitt in a duo with movie stars and center it really around these two individuals is what I think is so great about Hollywood amongst a bevy of other things. And then this is like a movie where the whole thing, like you said, it should be either through Bishop's perspective or I should feel that Nathan is teaching him something of importance to then draw them both back to one another other than their profession and the urgency of their job, the urgency of the political matters at hand. Because when you get down to it, I can't, usually in these movies, they teach the other person something to then either they go completely against it or they go completely for it, right? And it becomes a code, a set of rules maybe. This movie is kind of shaggy when it comes to all that. And by the time you're sort of invested in both of them giving a crap about one another, I don't know if I'm fundamentally caring about either one. Like when Brad Pitt goes in there, which is an impressive sequence of him sort of, sneaking into this, into this prison or whatever and whatnot. And I was like, oh, okay, this is kind of like a good way to start the movie. Mm-hmm. From that moment on, I don't care if he gets out. The only thing I really care about is like, okay, does Redford get to have like a good retirement? Because it would really
if he gets out, then you must hate this movie.
No, I mean, like
the movie's about.
No, but it's also like I kind of know he's going to get out, so why do I really have to care?
I mean, yeah,
you know what I mean. Like that's the point. It's like there's no suspense in a thriller like this. But then there's also for Nathan, I just don't feel like the last day when you find out your guy's in there, like haven't really seen him care that much enough.
Well, that's the Robert Redford thing, though, is this cooler than the situation. I'm going to. I mean,
I get
not
that.
Act like I'm affected,
but that's not what this character kind of should be, or kind of is trying.
That is the character. The character.
No,
the character has lived his life based.
But
on
that's not what the
philosophy
type
that
of. This is a type of character.
Collateral damage is of absolutely no.
I understand that
to me. So,
but then you're going to risk everything.
Well,
at the end
finally
for this guy
coming to terms with that past and
for this guy that we've seen like we've seen him together for what, like 15 20 minutes together?
Yes, I agree with you.
I mean, you're just like you're at that point it would just be like, I'm gonna give it up for
that's a fault. That's a problem with execution, not
exactly
an idea.
Exactly. Yeah. So then by the end you're just like, okay, well, you're giving up everything for this guy. Why?
I think one of the reasons that we have not talked about why this movie doesn't work totally with its characters and the dynamic between the two leads and ultimately why the movie feels politically messy is because there is a subplot with the character Elizabeth Hadley. And I think she's the character played by Catherine McCormack, who we've been talking about, who does her best in a role that clearly had more to give her than we saw in the final film.
Yeah.
That seems pretty obvious after multiple rewatches, which is interesting because, well, on one front, I do want to give Tony Scott credit because most action directors usually reduce a character like this to this dreamy, nightmarish kind of trope love interest. I'm looking at you, Christopher Nolan. Love Nolan, but also this is a problem.
Everybody's got their limitations.
More of an idea than a person.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
And I do think Tony Scott was trying to add a moral lesson through this character and getting away from this kind of dick measuring contest between Brad Pitt and Robert Redford's characters, where you see Brad Pitt have this, as Bishop, have this call to action moment, right? And almost did like this awakening at the cost of what his organization is doing by, instead of learning something productive from Redford, he kind of learns what not to do. And I did hear Scott talk about how, he spoke to and researched about women with his team in the field of, I think it was the Lebanese Civil War and the conflicts that came toward the end of that war and the impact that had on refugees and specifically Palestinians at the time and still, and how the Red Cross at the time pulled out of these places and some doctors stayed to help and basically be the middleman between conflicting groups. And Scott talked about how he basically wanted to shape this McCormack character through the lens of women like this that were in these situations around the 90s. And I just don't think he totally does that. And I think there's a huge just subplot missing from this film that probably was a studio decision, I would assume, to take off 20 minutes from this movie, which it would need to add something like that. And because of that, we feel this imbalance ultimately.
Yeah, and I think there were a lot of scenes cut, right, from her character. Apparently, she was going to have a relationship with Robert Redford, but then it wouldn't make sense as to why he would send her to a prison if he had a relationship with her. Like, it would just seem too, I guess,
cold,
out of his character. Yeah. Even though, his
I mean-
character's always already showing that signs. But I think, the issue with her character, too, is like, she is just used to as a reason for Brad Pitt to go back right to the prison, and there's not a lot of chemistry, even though I think she's great. Jay, like you were saying, there's not a lot of scenes that are in there for that. But I do think she has some interesting, pieces of dialogue that highlight the contradiction in Redford's character, like talking about where all of the like bullets are coming from, right? Like talking about the U.S. and she has a way to confront Robert Redford's character that then leads to Brad Pitt confronting Robert Redford's character. And so I kind of like, though, this idea, sometimes in Scott's movies, he has like the person who is the mentor, mentee, right? And he has the mentor like Denzel and Chris Pine in Unstoppable. And you like really are rooting for the mentor, right? Like rooting for Denzel. But here I kind of like that he flips that. Like, I like that Robert Redford actually might have something pointed out to him and like the contradictions pointed out to him. And on his last day of his job, he's like, do I regret my whole life? Like it's not that strong and it's not, as realized as that. But as far as an action movie, I think it's interesting that he includes that and doesn't make Robert Redford the kind of the moral character.
Jay, you're in finance. Can I liquidate my $260,000 in my Fidelity today? Is that possible?
Look,
is that something you can do?
If you're in the CIA, you can get anything done, right? These people have access to things we can't.
They're listening right now. What are you guys talking about? They're really angry at me at this point. No, I mean, like
that 200,000 so fast.
Man, I was like, yeah, good. I mean,
it was 282,000, correct?
Yeah.
Big bold red letters. Yeah.
Now we know what Trey's working with here. All right, but I'm gonna go gambling with him later. But no, I no, Kelsi, I agree with you because I actually think some of the stronger interactions between Pitt and Redford do contain her. There's that scene in the cafe where I was like, oh, I wish there was more of this sort of the duty of their job mixed with the fascination, the love aspect of it and everything. And also the fact that how dangerous Nathan sees this for Tom, right? As he's like, you can't, like, he is not like, oh yeah, you should go and pursue her and have a good time. Like, it's not one of those kind of movies. It's like, don't do this. This is like, it's the one time in the movie where he's just like, he's trying to point out her flaws to then dismiss her to get him focused back on the job. And it's an interesting thing to see because he is fighting essentially for Tom's soul as much as Elizabeth's trying to gain it. And I wish that's more explored. Like, there's a movie that's coming out later this year, where it's probably already out by the time we're recording, and it's The Bike Riders from Jeff Nichols. And I wouldn't have thought that both of these movies sort of coexist in the same universe, but they have all these fundamental ideas about, like, that's about biker gangs, this is about politics and in U.S., U.S.'s role in how we play overseas, and it's done through these great movie stars of our time, right? But there's a love triangle stuck in the middle of it, and the love triangle is actually really fascinating. If the screenwriters would have like dived into those a little bit more, they would have been able to actually pull a lot of the political intrigue, a lot of the espionage elements that probably could have heightened this movie and made this thriller even, more personal. And instead, it doesn't feel like that by the end. It just feels like, like there's loose threads, that her story is missing. Her dialogue is lessened a lot. And that's the other thing, too. It's like a movie like this should have crackling dialogue. It should have things that we're writing down, that we're quoting, and it doesn't. And that's kind of a problem with a movie like this. It's like, to make it a memorable entry in this, it's like you've got to be able to have that. And it's also a problem because, like, Tony Scott, we know him. He's worked with great screenwriters before, or had people come and punch up those screenplays, and I think that's kind of a little bit of the problem here is that the screenplay has left a lot to be desired.
But Ryan, who was producing those films when he was able to get those amazing screenwriters? And
well,
one of the biggest flaws of this movie is the supporting cast. Like, we just watched Enemy of State. Yeah. And in Enemy of State, you're just pumping your fist in every scene.
You're like, every actor is
actor who just
the
shows
cream
up.
of the crop.
Whether the dialogue is crackling or not, it's being delivered with it so well that it works. And that's Bruckheimer, right? I mean, Jerry Bruckheimer and Don Simpson were the very successful films in Tony Scott's filmography. Don Simpson passed away. He's moved on from Bruckheimer. He's getting into his own producing with the Scott Free thing with his brother. And this film, at least, and this will change as time goes on, but this film kind of feels like oh no, I don't have Jerry backing me up here. People aren't joining this movie just so they can work with Jerry. And that shows up to me mostly in the actors that are involved with this film, who are mostly like good, but it's not Viggo Mortensen, James Gandolfini, Philip Baker Hall,
Jason Robards.
Yeah, just these guys. Yeah, I don't know if Robards had a great relationship with Bruckheimer, but well, he's dead at this point, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe
just to be clear, he was, because you don't remember when Cormac McCarthy was alive or not. So
I did forget that Cormac McCarthy was dead.
Yeah.
But I'm still waiting for the counselor too. But I think the cast is a shortcoming of this movie, and to me, that's where I'm like, how did this movie cost $150 million? I know you got two huge stars here, but you didn't really shell out for the rest of the cast.
I feel like Universal just financed like the entire Sundance Film Festival off of this budget. Like it was like back-end points or something. I don't know.
I would assume that there was $50 million going to these two actors. Like I would have to imagine budget was going there.
Is Pitt a $50 million guy?
Well, 25 each-ish.
25 each is what
25 each.
20, 25.
Is he getting 25 already at this time?
I don't. Well, what's his? I guess it depends. What do you think his peak is?
What's his quote? It is Ocean's 11 peak. Actually, you know what? What did Ocean's 11 cost? I'm gonna look that up.
Because he's already had Fight Club. He's had 7.
Yeah, I would feel like this is right around that time, right? I mean, Ocean's 11
cost $85 million. What are we doing?
Yeah, $85 million, and it had all those stars in it. And I mean,
yeah.
And you know what the crazy thing about this movie is, and I saw this in preparation for this, is you talk about spy thrillers, I guess, and it's the next year, but Pitt turned down the Bourne franchise.
Yeah.
So that he could do this, and his Ocean's buddy Matt Damon got that. And it's some pretty good movies out of those things.
I don't think Pitt works in that.
No, I don't think it works either. I think there's kind of like, there's something about Damon in those movies that kind of actually really
Damon's always had that like something to prove energy to him. That Pitt, he's so smooth.
Yeah.
What is y'all's relationship to Pitt? I mean, obviously, right now, like,
let's do it.
Clear he's.
Oh, we're going into the Pitt corner.
We're going to the Pitt corner.
He's a piece of shit, with Angelina Jolie and all that stuff, and his family, and obviously that's incredibly tragic.
Stuff's gotten weird.
Yeah,
it's gotten worse and worse.
It's gotten real messy because it's all about a winery and they're all
well, them dropping the
kids dropping the names and and it's like he's being super casual and nice, and he's in the public perception about it, like with an Oscar speech or whatever, and the kids behind the scene are like, no, we hate him, and it's all extending around this one, story about a plane and pushing Angelina up against the wall. But then at the same time, he's doing
weird movies.
Yeah,
over
you
the
can
past
almost
5-7
you feel like
years.
his team was preparing for this, right? Like
Yeah.
all the kind of cameos that he's been doing and roles that he's been taking.
Yeah,
And
playing
what's
against
the
his
Lost
charm,
City?
good looks.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he's kind of like in a coasting age, right? Because like
Especially after the Oscar.
because he won the Oscar. He's won an Oscar as a producer. He's won an Oscar as an actor now. He also did Ad Astra in the same year as Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And he's still producing a ton of movies with Plan B. But like, yeah, 2020 post Oscar has been what? Bullet Train and the Lost City, right? Was where he had that cameo, and he's pretty good in that.
Or like Bullet Train.
And yeah,
I think
and
he's
then-
solid in Babylon, but I'm a Babylon fan. So
I'm a
that's-
Babylon
Babylon
defender as well.
supporters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Babylon
Yeah.
5 rise up.
I'm.
If you ask my relationship with Brad Pitt, it is obviously getting more difficult to say this, but he's one of my favorite actors. I mean, just like
Sure.
straight up.
I think you
he
can
has
say
a
that, but
great
it's just
choice
it's
of
you're not-
filmmakers. You
yeah.
look at the list of directors he's worked with. He's got really good taste. It seems like we were just talking about Will Smith last week on Enemy of the State, and my big complaint about Will Smith is like he's I don't know if he's scared or he just doesn't want to give himself over to filmmakers. Brad Pitt seems to be a guy who really is like, I want to make interesting work with interesting filmmakers who can mold me in ways that are interesting. And he's done that really well, and he's
willing
one
to
of a
work.
kind as far as he's got that thing that you can't teach, that movie star quality, and he uses that, but he'll also stretch himself, which I love.
Well, he's still very bankable, and
yeah.
regardless of everything obviously that's terrible in his personal life, people in Hollywood love working with him. He goes and champions a lot of films that other people won't. I mean, he is a big reason, and Plan B is a big reason why 12 Years a Slave and Moonlight win Best Picture. Which is great. I mean, he's
producing Beetlejuice.
Is he really?
Apparently, that's what it says.
Okay, good for him.
I am excited for that.
That is one trailer I don't know. My wife is such a big fan of the first Beetlejuice, and when I saw Furiosa with her, she saw that trailer and she was cringing in her seat. But then she saw the Maxine trailer and she's like, okay, cinema's back. I was like, oh, okay. All right,
I keep
cool.
trying to convince myself that Tim Burton's going to come back, but it's been
I feel like, yeah, it's when was the last great Tim Burton movie?
Ooh, that's a really
the
good
last like
question.
truly great one. It depends, I guess. I'm not like a huge Big Fish guy.
I love Big Fish.
I
I really like his Sweeney Todd, but
like
I know
like
everybody's
Sweeney
like,
Todd, but I
yeah.
wouldn't call it great.
I wouldn't call it great.
I like Sleepy Hollow. I wouldn't call it great.
Sleepy Hollow.
I would
is
say
a
Ed
movie that's
Wood.
better.
That was 30 years ago.
That's
I mean,
tough.
it's tough, right? It's like
He's made
'cause
good stuff since then, but as far as great,
What has he made that's been good since Sweeney Todd?
I'm looking at it right now. Sleepy Hollow, I think, is good.
Okay.
Mars Attacks, I think, is pretty good. Big Fish, I think, is pretty good.
No, I'm saying since Sweeney Todd, what has he made? That
Since Sweeney Todd, sorry.
Yeah.
No,
Do that
Alice in
run.
Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland, one of the worst films ever made. Dark Shadows is tough. I maintain that Alice in Wonderland is the ugliest movie ever put to screen.
Correct.
It is appalling.
I have no memory of it, so that makes sense.
we're going to make you watch it.
The
and
best
come back
movie
on
he's
next
made
week.
since Sweeney Todd is Frankenweenie, which is solid.
An animated,
Okay.
yeah, and it's like the third or fourth best animated movie of that year. And then he's got like Dumbo and Big Eyes.
Well, Big Eyes was his attempt at like kind of recapturing
And
legitimacy. and it
that
didn't
movie's
really
not
work.
good. And he's got Mrs. Peregrine's Home for the Kids or whatever.
Yeah, Mrs. Peregrine's Home for the Kids.
Yeah, is that what it's called? I don't remember what it is.
He gave us Batman Returns, so
Yeah,
I'm
look,
seated for
he's in my
Beetlejuice
good
too,
graces,
so I'm-
but
Yeah.
it's been a tough run.
It's rough.
It's been
And
a
then-
tough 20 years.
Are you guys looking forward to seriously? Are you guys looking forward to Beetlejuice?
I
Beetlejuice?
am, because I liked the original as a kid. I thought it was a horror movie, and I have not watched it since as like an adult. And I think I'm literally not gonna rewatch the first one and just go into the second one and see how that goes, because I don't want to hold it to the same standard. Obviously, if we do an episode on it, we'll have to rewatch the first one. But I'm excited for it. I also I'm a fan of Winona Ryder and Keaton, and so like I think that's just exciting to team up again. I'm trying to not get my expectations too high so it doesn't let me down. I'm totally fine with just watching a 3.5-star Beetlejuice 2, and hopefully it can make some money. We'll see.
Yeah.
That's being optimistic at 3.5 stars.
3.5 stars for Burton would be really good for him.
That'd be really good.
I'll take 3. We'll say there. Yeah, I'm good there.
Kels?
Yeah, I don't have a huge relationship to Beetlejuice because I was so terrified of it growing up.
Oh.
And, I'd catch moments of it on cable. So I'm looking forward to rewatching it. But I remember it basically being like The Conjuring to when I was younger. Of someone haunting
Mars
me.
Attacks was
Burton films.
Mars Attacks was that movie for me when I was a kid. I was terrified of it because it was just like I didn't understand that it was. I didn't understand that it was a satire. So when I was a kid, I thought, oh, like these are aliens coming. And I was like 5 or whatever. I'm like, oh, there's like aliens coming down and killing the president of the United States, and like putting people's heads on dogs. This is terrifying. You know what I mean? When you're a young kid. Now you're an adult.
The early Tim Burton magic, though.
Yeah. No.
Horror, whimsy.
Yeah. But no, Ed Wood's probably his best movie.
And for Brad Pitt, for you guys, what's your go-to? Because I'm a huge
man. This is tough because he has so many great movies, and that's like By the way, I'm not a Babylon defender, but I truly think Ocean's 11
is the movie I watch as much as any other movie.
But I do love Pitt in it. I think he's actually the best part in Babylon, and because I think that arc of that character is so tragic, especially when you really look at his life too now. The meta-ness of it is actually kind of wild. And then I think the movie kind of falls apart after he's gone. But
Inglourious Bastards is great.
Bastards is probably, if I had to pick, his best movie.
No, that's not true.
Even though he's not the lead of that movie.
That's not true, Jay. That is a lie. Your favorite Brad Pitt movie is Tree of Life.
Oh God, you're right. Yes, I forgot.
Come on, it's like your favorite movie of all time, and you're just like, I just
went to my. I just sorted my Brad Pitt's filmography by my highest rating on Letterboxd, and there's 8 5-stars on here. So I mean,
Moneyball is a movie that is insanely rewatchable for me. It is a drop the remote. It's a remote drop movie, and
it's one of the most underrated films of the last 15 years. I think.
It's actually just like it is a really great like 1-2 punch for Sorkin at that time with that and The Social Network, back-to-back years of really talking about really the future and consequences, I think, of American sports and how analytics, unintentionally or not, based off these guys, has become such a dominant force for so many sports teams, and also just like the character arc of Billy Beane as a whole is a sad individual of being like someone that, and like I made this argument many years ago. I was on another show, and someone was trying to tell me that movie has an optimistic ending. I'm like, it does not. It's sad because you created something and then you stuck there, and then you watched other people become very successful off of it, and you never. I mean, you get a movie after you, but you don't get what you want in sports, which is to win a championship. That's his fundamental thing that he never won, and it's actually quite sad when you think about that for Billy Beane. And I think that
loses a relationship with his daughter. Listening to the music at the end. Yeah.
Exactly. And so
it's the classic Sorkin. It was about his kid all along.
I mean, like
Steve Jobs.
Yeah, I mean, looking at it, I mean, like his work with Fincher is foundational. I mean, like I love Seven, and I really love Benjamin Button. When we did a movie series, when we did that movie series a couple of years ago on the old show, that was the one that has just kind of risen over the years.
That movie makes me weep.
Jesse James
me too. Yeah.
Jesse James is such an important film of that 2007 year of just great movies that came out. I mean, Oceans and Inglourious Bastards are completely rewatchable.
Well, now we're just running down his whole filmography.
Yeah,
what about y'all? What's your relationship to Pitt?
I mean, I feel like I associate him, we grew up in a huge like celebrity culture tabloids, right? Like Brad Pitt was on every cover of every magazine at the grocery store. Like,
Aniston,
Jennifer Aniston.
Exactly. Yeah. The Mr. and Mrs. Smith and the Angelina
Friends
Jolie.
TV
That's
show
all
appearance.
20 years ago at this point now, which is insane.
Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like so many people have a relationship to him. And I think, when we're talking about like Tarantino really knows how to use him. And I like the idea of him. He's kind of doing now what Ryan Gosling has kind of set the path for, which is like making fun of his kind of charm in a way, or playing against himself in that way. So that's fascinating. But I'm a huge Ocean's fan. I know he started shooting Ocean's 11, I think a week after Spy Game. So I love how he's used in that, eating a lot of food, using that jawline. But I really also love him in like The Big Short. I think it's an underrated performance where he does something a little different. And I also just love that movie.
Yeah, I know it's
I
not
like the
cool
movie a
to
lot.
like Adam McKay right
It's
now.
not,
for a
but
variety
that's a
of
good
reasons.
movie. Yeah.
The Big Short rocks.
Yeah.
And also, I know we have a finance guy on here, but it did teach a generation just about, I guess maybe not the right things, obviously, what's happened since, but it did provoke a generation to learn more about finance, I think, in interesting ways. I love Brad Pitt in The Big Short. I think he's never really done a role like that. I think the closest he's done to something like that probably is Moneyball, where he is this kind of reluctant, competitive guy still who's just trying to get away from the game but can't get away. I agree with the Tarantino assessment. I think Soderbergh and Fincher for me is who I think of when I think of Brad Pitt. Like Soderbergh knows how to just give us a movie star, and he does that with like 10 actors over that trilogy. And I think David Fincher is more so looking at Brad Pitt like, how can I make you into an asshole?
Yeah.
And which Fincher is a master at, just for so many actors. But specifically with Pitt, even in a movie like Fight Club, which I have a ton of problems with, what he does with Pitt in that film and what he lets him do is wild. We just really haven't seen anything like that since. And when we do see it, we think of it as like a caricature, or they're doing Brad Pitt in Fight Club. So that's a pretty iconic movie. But I think the one that's most informative to my movie loving is probably Seven, like David Mills, like Detective Mills, and The Box, everything. Just it's incredible. It's an incredible
What's in
film.
the box?
What's in the box?
Got to do it. It's
so good.
It's great, and his dynamic with Freeman is wild too. I mean, it's just I think a perfect thriller.
But that's the other thing too about a movie like that, right? Morgan Freeman's this great actor at this point, and Pitt's still relatively youngish in his career. That's not a baton passing, but that's a
prove it movie.
That is a prove it that you're a superstar. Prove it you can also act opposite one of the great actors of our time. And it's about a grizzled veteran and a younger cop coming together to solve this case. And like that movie takes its time in establishing that relationship, and for you to buy into it. And obviously Freeman's narration and everything. And I mean, I think of the key scene in that movie is the dinner sequence when Freeman comes over and him buying this
wine in the regular glasses. It's
in the
amazing.
regular glasses, but it's like the train is above him, and the guy that sold it to him timed it perfectly for that apartment. But then that's when they sort of start opening up, and then that's when that movie starts opening up, right? And that's the thing. It's like he's made this movie before, and it's been really successful. So that's why it's like frustrating with Spy Game. The other thing that's frustrating about why it doesn't work with him in Spy Game is because his counterpart in Spy Game directed him in a goddamn movie like 10 years before, and a river runs through it. So he knows how to tap into this as an actor and a director relationship. So he knows as a performer what Brad Pitt can give him. So it's not like it's something new for Redford, who Redford is within himself one of the greatest movie stars of all time.
I'll also say this, the scene where maybe the best scene in the movie where they are just at the bar having a beer, training up, maybe the worst hair Brad Pitt's ever had. That's a tough one.
Insane.
The wigs
That's a
are
tough
wild.
look.
I noted it and every second in my notes. Yeah.
Yeah. Honestly, they're so absurd. We could have just taken the thumbs from Spy Kids and put them in this movie. Nobody would have noticed next to those wigs. They're wild. Yeah.
Could you and the ADR work on that would have been like Madam Web level. You know what I mean? Like
We might have to do a Robert Rodriguez series, Ryan. Have him back on.
That's kind of a rough filmography.
It's a long few months.
That's
I was going to make the hot take that I actually think Spy Game is one of Pitt's worst performances. It's not that I think he's bad. It's kind of the Tony Scott thing that Jay was saying earlier. I'm not sure Brad Pitt's been necessarily bad in any movie. I think, though, this is probably where I see him struggling the most. I think he needs a lot of screen time in order to really kind of feel out his own characters. And it doesn't seem like he really totally ever realizes this character. I think it's the most obvious when there's a German man that he's trying to take to the border or something like that. And he has to like force him out of his car. And it's like the most emotional moment for the character in the movie. And he just kind of never gets there with that character. And I'm not sure exactly why. And maybe it is just kind of he's preparing for the Soderbergh Ocean's 11 movie, which is arguably going to even be a bigger deal for his career, which I'm sure he was aware of at the time because of Clooney and that ensemble cast and Roberts. But yeah, I just don't know if he fully was invested in this film. In fact, I was thinking maybe get a little bit less Brad Pitt, get some more of the secretary Gladys, like Marianne John Baptiste.
Great.
Or we have one scene with Charlotte Rampling, which is insane to me.
I know, yeah, it's such a small part.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. Like that is the most where he is actually showing some sort of like conflicted, right? He is throwing someone out of his car that later he's going to go tell Robert Redford like these people aren't baseball cards that you can just trade.
That's a good line.
That's a good
like
line.
But I think just to support my Ridley Scott take, I think Ridley Scott knows how to use Brad Pitt a little bit more than Tony in this movie, because I feel like Tony Scott is he's using Brad Pitt in ways of like playing to his charm, but it's just the way that it's cut or however it just like came together. There is an aspect of him like playing one note, and that's just part of the character, I think, in the movie and the way it's structured. But I feel like Ridley Scott in Thelma and Louise was like, there's something a little gross about you, like I'm gonna get into that too.
Well,
even
Tony,
though you're charming.
Yeah,
there's something
that's a
even
really good call. But Tony has that too because he put him in True Romance.
No, you're
Yeah.
right. You're right. Yeah.
But
He's
that's a
been,
good call.
and the thing about it is, he's been dying to get back with Tony Scott at this point.
He's been so thirsty.
He has
for
been
Tony.
so
Every
thirsty.
movie, it's like Brad Pitt was on his hands and knees.
He's like,
saying,
I will
"Let me
play."
be in Crimson Tide.
He was even like, wasn't he trying to be like in Enemy of the State? He was trying to be the.
He was trying to be the Hackman.
He was trying to be the Hackman character in Enemy of the State, and you're like, what? Like you'll just hold a light in this film, won't you? You'll just like hold the boom mic, and yeah, then it's like you get this, and you're like, this is what you waited for all those years. But then, like, yeah, Kelsey, you're right, because I forgot about I had forgot about Thelma and Louise for half a second, but then I was thinking about like the counselor and just how he's in like that for a couple scenes, and that's a character completely just within like 2 or 3 scenes of that movie, right? But he's able to capture everything that you need within the essence of Brad Pitt, but then tap into this darkness of this guy that's handing off this bad news or the set of rules that the counselor has to follow in that movie. And you buy into it because he establishes himself and who he is and his set of values, as well as also the stakes of the game that Fassbender's getting involved with in that film. So like, I do kind of agree with you there. Like, it is weird to say that the better Brad Pitt performance in the Tony Scott movie is in True Romance, where he's just playing a stoner character that just kind of is like, you know what I mean? But like, but like it is because he doesn't properly showcase him here, and it showcases Redford, who's made better movies like this before. Like, I mean, Redford's career, I don't know what y'all's relationship with Redford is. I love Redford. I grew up watching a lot of his movies, and I revere him as just this great talent, this force in the industry, obviously, with what he does with independent cinema. As a director, he's pretty hit or miss of late, but early on he made one of the greatest Best Picture winners of all time. You know what I mean? In Ordinary People, which is, a movie I absolutely love, and even Quiz Show is another one, and A River Runs Through It, where those are solid, great movies. And but now he's slowly at this point of his career, he's starting to fade, and it's like, he can phone it in or not, or he can kind of go through these projects where it doesn't seem like there's a lot of, like, I wouldn't say a paycheck, but I'm resting on performances and calling back to performances I've done before that are much more interesting. And I think it takes like him a while to get back to making a really interesting performance, like in a movie that I loved over like the last 5-6 years, which is like The Old Man and the Gun,
which is his
Lowry.
legacy movie. That's kind of doing some of what this movie is trying.
Exactly, and understanding the importance and what he can and what Lowry can do with time and legacy. He's a really, I mean, he's one of our
It's a much more
directors.
sentimental movie,
Yeah,
obviously.
but that movie's so damn rewatchable too. It's so great. I don't know. That's one I've seen like maybe 10, 15 times. I don't know. But yeah, I don't know what you guys think about Redford. Maybe you don't like him. I don't know.
Good.
Yeah, I
don't think I have
he's
15
good.
minutes on Redford like Pitt, but
No, we can give 15 minutes to Robert Redford. No, I'm just kidding. No, we don't have to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have like a huge relationship to the career of Redford, though I do love the movies he's in. Like the Sidney Pollack stuff is phenomenal. The George Roy Hill stuff is great. I'm a huge Pakula guy, and so All the President's Men is massive for me. So I'm going to take the kind of basic answer and say that All the President's Men is kind of the masterpiece and one of his best performances, if not his best. I think Kelsi said it earlier that he has this kind of like unreadable yet approachable face, and he always does that in his movies. I mean, sometimes he does some character bits, but he never goes to the length of someone like Brad Pitt, where he gets so absurd but still brilliant. I think with Redford, he always brings this like level of controlled stoicism, and then he will break it sometimes, but he always feels very calculated and very mysterious, and he's at his best when he's at that level. So I like him a lot. Obviously, he's a great actor and one of the more important actors in the history of cinema. I just kept thinking about, while watching Spy Game, we don't really have an actor like Robert Redford today. I don't know if that is good or bad necessarily in terms of obviously just like him as an identity, doing this like white straight cis guy like kind of stoic thing, but also in addition to that, I also think actors like his qualities that he has that I was just talking about, they're really more in television today, which I think is fascinating. Or I guess you could argue they're just in supporting roles in movies. I thought a lot about somebody like Jason Clarke. I thought a lot about Kyle Chandler, which is, he's a great supporting actor, but they're doing similar.
Like Scorsese kind of uses him in a way that Redford is used in other movies.
But the difference is Robert Redford is so hot.
Yes, and so that's what I was going to say. That the difference is he looks like a model, right?
Yeah.
Like that is the for sure. I mean, Coach Taylor, clear eyes, full hearts, can't lose. But
Damn right.
So yeah, Texas. There you go.
There you go.
So yeah, I don't know. There aren't a lot of actors like Redford. I was going to ask you guys that today if you can think of any. But yeah, he's great. I have nothing bad to say about him.
Yeah, and he does such a like great DC guy.
Yes, good point.
We're both from DC.
Yeah,
so yeah.
Yes, he plays a bureaucrat really well.
Yeah.
Like kind of jaded, a little bit indifferent, but also has his own agenda. Yeah.
He finds his way perfectly in and out of the suit.
Yes.
That's the thing. I mean, like, that's why I loved watching Ethan Hawke's documentary about Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward a couple of years ago, The Last Movie Star, because when you see that Redford's mindset as an artist was formed a lot through his collaborations, interactions with Joanne and Paul, and how selfless of individuals those two were, while also having a deeply complicated relationship. Her being the movie star when he first got with her, and then his obviously historic rise, and then their humanitarian work and everything in between, and what they were doing. Like, they are the model example of what you should use your clout as a movie star to be, and we don't have that anymore. That is, the answer to the question is, I think it's an incomplete question or incomplete answer, I guess, because how many? We obviously we hear a lot nowadays, and I think it's so jaded when by most people, of like celebrities leaning into doing things for political reasons or using their voice for their platforms or whatnot. And back then there wasn't a lot of, hey, look at me, I'm doing this, or I'm creating this, or building these spaces in between. Like, Redford is very politically active, but he's also a champion more than anybody for creating a film festival that's garnered some of the greatest voices of the last 25, 30 years. And understanding that, you know, you have to build the industry from the ground up in terms of getting those voices out to so many people. Now, obviously, that then there's the challenges of then making sure that those voices become more diverse and more unique as you're building out a place like that. And so, and he has done that, and the leadership over at Sundance is trying to do that every single year. And it's tough because the landscape of the world changes, and visibility and who is making movies is changing every single year as well too. And the type of films that are getting made are very difficult. But I don't know if there's anybody like him. I mean, like Pitt is, I mean, obviously behind the scenes a really, you know, not a great person, but he does do a lot of humanitarian work. He has independent, you know, it has an independent production studio that finances a lot of movies. Like I said, that, you know, a lot of studios won't touch, or a lot of filmmakers that are people of color or women. And he's a great actor within himself. So
wasn't
maybe
there a huge lawsuit with a bunch of the houses he was building in New Orleans or something after Katrina? Something weird.
No, I thought that, or was it Penn? Or was it him? I don't remember.
I think it was
because I know
Pitt was
that,
doing a ton of stuff in New Orleans after
Yeah,
Katrina.
it's
The only
true.
person I can think of how you're describing him is right now, I guess, is George Clooney.
It's Clooney, but Clooney's not but Clooney's weirdly in this space of like not making interesting films anymore.
No, he's in the
director.
Redford zone, directing mediocre movies.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
his and obviously his wife is extremely, you know, that is her job. She is, you know, extremely involved in politics, and
Seems like there are a few people that have a bad word to say about Clooney, which is cool.
no, I mean, like Clooney is, when he can turn it on, when he turn the light switch on, like Clooney's one of the great actors that we have working today, and he's
Truly charismatic.
I mean, nobody can do, I think, some of the work that he's done over his career. Like, I think of the one shot when I think of Ocean's 11 is him coming up the escalator to start up that movie. And you're just like, okay, this movie has begun because a movie star has walked into the door. You know, Michael Clayton is a movie that I'm a big stand for that movie. And I think a lot of that has to do with Clooney's vulnerability in that role. And I know that Denzel Washington was toying with that, and I think that it would have been a totally different and interesting character. I would love to see that. Honestly, I would love to see like a stage version of that where Denzel gets to play that, or you know, but there's just something about like the sadness in Clooney's eyes in that movie that is really profound to me. So
Batman and Robin, just the sadness in his eyes.
A classic.
I mean, it's the sadness of a paycheck clearing, right? But no, I mean, probably Clooney's the right answer. I don't know.
What do you think is the limit on the BAT credit card?
That is
there one?
That is interesting. Yeah, who called about that too? By the way, like who called? Like, you know, like I'm Batman. I need to double my limit here. You're like, sorry, sir, we can't hear you. You knew mine speaking a little clearer into the phone.
In Nolan's verse, I'm pretty sure Bruce Wayne is just like heavily in debt. Yeah, he
is by the end, right? Like he is in heavy. Well, he loses all of his finances, right? In Rises, and then like
and all that investment that he was trying to get for military contracts didn't seem to be working out too well.
Yeah,
Nolan. Anyway, is there anything else you guys want to talk about Spy Game before we get out of here?
What do you think? We've hit on a lot.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about a lot, but I think just bringing up Denzel, like I think that Tony Scott and Denzel's relationship, and like how Denzel is able to really elevate Tony Scott's like action movies and bring something a bigger like emotional punch to them.
Yeah.
That's kind of what it feels like is lacking, even though it's surprising because we have these heavy hitters in Brad Pitt and Robert Redford here. So yeah.
I think there are two big groups of Tony Scott fans. I think, and you can be both, but and you know, there's a lot of crossover. But I think that everybody agrees that Crimson Tide is great. That seems to be pretty universal. But I think there is one group that really stands tall for The Last Boy Scout, True Romance, Revenge, like kind of the Tarantino more kind of based crowd. Then there's the, I think, Enemy of the State, Man on Fire, Deja Vu, Spy Game crowd. And that's more where I am, probably just because when I was growing up watching what we said at the top, like TNT, just cable network stuff, like those are the movies that were playing the most. And I have such a electric relationship to those films. And so going off what Kelsey's saying, yeah, I think what Will Smith and what Denzel and what, now Brad Pitt and Robert Redford bring to these movies are what make them so memorable to me, because they do elevate the material, they elevate the style, and they're kind of just in conversation with that Tony Scott that we love so much. But yeah, I think this is a good movie. I think that we were all like pretty like healthily critical of the film because it has a lot of holes and a lot of flaws, and it's the imbalance is felt. But I had a good time talking about it, and I had a good time rewatching it as well.
Yeah.
J-Dog? Anything?
Yeah, I'll say this. I think there is a really good version of this movie where Elizabeth's character is really fleshed out and they dig into that romance. I mean, who's better than Brad Pitt at establishing chemistry and really giving a felt sense of romance? There could be this like combative, I mean, like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, that relationship, Ocean's 12, that relationship, where it is these two people who are falling for each other, but also at odds with each other from a practical perspective. And I think Elizabeth's character is also very interesting. She's this person who was sort of this revolutionary who was blowing up buildings, and to kind of establish this dichotomy between her character and Redford's character, she accidentally killed some civilians and is like totally torn up about it. And it has put her in a life of exile. And meanwhile, Redford is, riding high on, in his department and as a member of the CIA, because that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to detach yourself from this. And Elizabeth is a person who is unable to detach herself from the problems that she has caused in her past. So there is this dichotomy between Muir and Elizabeth, and then you've got Bishop stuck in the middle, which it feels like that should be this really effective push and pull. But because there's just not enough Elizabeth in the film, it's lacking. There's kind of this hole in the middle where I'm like, this could have been filled by these two great actors who I feel like would have had incredible chemistry if they were given the opportunity to do so. So that for me is maybe, other than Redford and Pitt being on screen more together, that's probably the biggest missed opportunity for me.
That's a really good point, because I think so many of Tony Scott's great films are about sacrifice. A lot of the characters are going through some kind of like self-destructive or sacrificial journey. And it would have been maybe just interesting to have, if you had Elizabeth have more screen time, that character would have had an interesting sacrifice route, almost like how we saw Denzel in Man on Fire. That would have been fascinating. Yeah, that's too bad.
My final thought is, I wish that lunch spread looked better in the boardroom. That was it's quite disappointing. I was just like, damn, man, they can't get like some better looking food in there. My God, it's like it's his last day too, and you're like bringing him in here asking all these damn questions. Get him some good damn food. That's all I really have. It always bugs me when it's just like if it's your last day, let the man go and get like, what do you want? Nathan, oh, I would really like this from this area. You didn't do that. You just got some weak ass sandwiches or whatever. It's ridiculous. Jay?
Yes.
Before we get out of here, Jay, we're going to test your award season knowledge based on the film we just reviewed, Spy Game, in a segment we like to call It's an Honor to Get Nominated. Now, Jay, we've gone back and forth in this series. You've been surprised a lot. So I got to ask you, what Oscars was Spy Game nominated for?
There's no way this was nominated for Oscars. I do not believe so. And we should also mention this was largely because of that inflated budget. This was a bomb. It made about 143 million, just a few less than Spy Kids. We should mention Spy Kids outgrossed Spy Game. But it was a financial disappointment, big time for old Tony.
Well, that doesn't. I mean, but it could get nominated for an Oscar, couldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it could, but it didn't.
Well, you know what? You're correct.
Let's go.
You're correct, Jay. Wasn't nominated for really anything this year.
Nickelodeon's Kid Choice.
Well, you would think when you got movie stars that you get like the occasional, like we did with Enemy of the State, we get the MTV Movie Awards to come and help us out to really talk about the wild and wackiness of this year. But sadly, no, it was nominated at the Motion Picture Sound Editors the Golden Reel Awards. It was nominated for sound editing, for 2 sound editing nominations there. And then it was nominated at everyone's least favorite award show, the Satellite Awards, for the score.
What was that first award that you said?
I said the Golden Reel Award.
How does that exist? What is that?
It's the sound editors.
Biggest budget.
The guild. Yeah, like the guild. Yeah.
All right.
Motion picture sound editors. He sounded so upset about it.
Good for them. I just don't understand how all these awards bodies are like a thing. It's
because everyone's got a guild, buddy.
We love a guild.
Jay, what guild would you be a part of?
I would be a member of the Tony Scott Guild.
All right.
Responsible for maintaining the legacy of one Tony Scott, who would be 80 this month.
Yes, he would. This was the 2002 Oscars. This was Jay, your favorite movie of all time, A Beautiful Mind. I'm being super sarcastic because that movie sucks. That won Best Picture, and Ron Howard won Best Director, and one of the worst Best Director wins of all time. Great lineup outside of it, but it's a terrible director win. So you guys wouldn't.
Fellowship. Wow, Fellowship got the nomination. I just forget how well Lord of the Rings kind of cleared out in the Oscars.
Well, it did well. It did well its first year, and then the second year it kind of squeaked in. Like it got like a couple of texts. It didn't get director or screenplay, and it kind of squeaked into picture. And then of course, 0304 is when it swept for Return of the King. But yeah, that's the year of Peter Jackson, Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Rings, Ridley Scott, Black Hawk Down, Robert Altman for Gosford Park, and David Lynch for Mulholland Drive. And then they gave it to Ron Howard for A Beautiful Mind, because they saw Mulholland Drive and said, no thanks. We like A Beautiful Mind more.
Nothing worse than when David Lynch gets on Twitter and is like, I got something coming out next week.
And it's like another weather report.
Music video that he shot in about 25 minutes.
But yeah, no, it's a good year of movies. I don't think any of us would put Spy Game in any of these categories. Which
Best Picture,
Best Supporting Actress, Best Screenplay. Yeah. So with that being said, Kelsi and Trey, thank you so much for coming on this wild show.
Awesome. Y'all kept us mostly on the rails, which is
a
real achievement.
Yeah, we did not go as on many tangents as we thought we usually do. But the show hasn't ended,
which I appreciate.
You never know. I mean, Jay's a madman. But like the show hasn't ended yet, and the
also takes incredible skill.
The last 20 minutes of the show usually go on the rail, like we're doing right now. So shut up, Jay. Can you tell everyone where we can find you and all your work on the internet, please, guys?
Yeah, sure. People can find us on their podcast platforms, the Extra Credits. We love listening to AwardsWatch. This is a really cool show. I like that you guys are covering director filmographies. That's definitely an ambition for us in the future, though that is kind of an overwhelming idea a little bit because our show covers new releases so frequently. I know you guys do too. But yeah, we do similar things to y'all when you cover new releases. We usually trying to talk about the movie's narrative and style and see what works versus what doesn't work. And we can go from 4 hours on a Dune episode to an hour and a half on Hitman. So yeah, I love everything you guys are doing. Thanks for having us on the show. It was a ton of fun. Love to come back. Love to have you guys on eventually when your schedule frees up. We can make that work. Maybe talk about some of the best movies of the year. That might be fun. Because it has been, even though film Twitter would tell you differently, I still think it's been a really great year. Like the top 10 movies of the year already are pretty solid for me. So yeah, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thanks for having us, guys. It was fun.
Thank you guys for coming on. Yes, please go and follow them and sign up for their Patreon as well too. They got a lot of good bonus episodes and backlog of their catalog. Jay,
yeah.
Where can we find all of you and all your work? And you got a recommendation? Actually, before you even do that, do you guys have maybe a recommendation for the audience? Movie?
Seen anything good lately?
Seen anything good lately? We usually like to leave a recommendation for everybody.
Pull up my letterbox real quick.
Yeah, let me see. What have I seen that's good lately? So we just did the Before trilogy, and we were going through Linklater's filmography, and I revisited Suburbia. and I hadn't seen that in a long time. And I know that Linklater's vibe is chill, and that's why people come back to it. But that's one of his darkest films, and I do recommend people check that out again. I also think Steve Zahn is like a legendary like supporting actor, and he's doing some great stuff in that movie. So that's one I watched recently over the past week or two. We also did Fury Road on the Patreon, so we watched all George Miller stuff. And I gotta say, Happy Feet kind of rules. So I would check that out too if you're looking for something a little bit lighter than Suburbia.
You also have like a nostalgic relationship to it.
Nope, it just rocks. No,
Robin Williams doing a lot of voices in that one.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah, Happy Feet too, a little bit, a little too much.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot for our kind of model is to, instead of doing the full director filmography, we'll do like a few from their filmography as they're coming out. So I really loved in preparation for like challengers, I found that a lot of people were finding like a bigger splash. And I want people to go check out more of Luca Guadagnino's filmography, especially if people love Challenger, since that was his most commercial movie.
A movie that has the love triangle that maybe Spy Game needed.
Yeah,
and another recommendation for love triangle people, Scorsese, speaking of him, Color of Money. I don't know, we might have brought that up earlier, but Color of Money is just, I mean, an iconic film, and they do that a lot better too. So yeah, those are some recs.
Man, Jay, you better come in and go with your recommendation, because they just came in with like 4 or 5 films.
I've got like a super moderate recommendation. I feel like last week I came in pretty. No, it wasn't last week. It was, when did I recommend Sperm World? That was a real high. That was 2 weeks ago. That was 2 weeks ago. Yeah, I watch that one. It's great. As well as Ren Fair, which the director also directed. But anyway, I already recommended those, I think. So first of all, I want to say thank you, Kelsi and Trey. I was not familiar with your podcast before Ryan said y'all were coming on, and now I'm subscribed. It's awesome. I listened to them and I was like, oh, these are like really smart, eloquent people. I gotta be on my A game. So no, I've really been enjoying y'all's show, and we'll continue to listen for sure. So thank y'all for coming on.
Thanks, man.
And as far as me, Mr. J Ledbetter on Twitter, J Ledbetter on Letterboxd, I'm giving the mildest recommendation imaginable, because I feel like I've just been given all these recommendations and I haven't been watching the best stuff in the world. The documentary Jim Henson Idea Man, since I recommended the Muppet movie last week, Jim Henson Idea Man is quintessential Ron Howard. It's perfectly fine. So check it out.
Incredible record.
I'm a big Muppet guy, and if you are a big Muppet person, you'll really enjoy that. Jim Henson was and it really shines the light on kind of his mind beyond just children's programming, and how he did have kind of this avant-garde mentality in some ways, and wanted to be really subversive, but sort of got cornered to a certain extent. So it's really good. There's some great archival footage in it. So I would recommend watching that and giving it a solid 3 stars on Letterboxd.
Well, there you go. It's not always 5-star recommendations every week. So
yeah.
You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd at Ryan McQuade 77. You can find all my work here at awardswatch.com. If you like podcasts, we have our main show that we do every week, which is on that's released on Mondays, because this is released on Thursdays. iTunes, Spotify, 5-star reviews, we greatly appreciate it. While you're over on the website, please sign up for our newsletter. It's a great place to get all of our news, reviews, interviews, and podcasts sent to you twice a week, and we greatly appreciate it. Recommendation of the week. Well, we talked about kind of a middle-of-the-road Robert Redford film. So it's only right to recommend a good Robert
Ryan
Redford
ending
movie.
the show with a cough and sip.
Sorry, would you shut up? I was
here.
literally going to edit it out. Sorry, like I literally got like a bad.
Leave it in. Leave it all in.
Fine, we're leaving it in.
People need to see the process.
Yeah, you don't need to see this process. I'm going to literally cough again here. So thanks, Jay. Is a movie called Downhill Racer, which is a movie where Robert Redford is a young, ambitious skier who is trying to compete in Europe to go to the Olympics, and the U.S. team is run by this actor named Gene Hackman. Ever heard of him? And the movie is good.
It's
not great. The reason why it's really
We're
good,
knocking it out of the park here with the recommendations, right?
we really are. And the reason why it's really good is I think the way in which the film is shot and the camera movements, and we really get the first person's perspective of him skiing these events. So it's really kind of like, honestly, Jay, I was thinking a lot about Speed Racer as a movie.
Oh, wow.
When I was thinking about how jarring these sequences are. They're really great. And you really get the sort of propulsion and visceralness of being in, having to get the fastest time ever. The movie, though, detours into this kind of melodrama between him and a Italian or like a French girl, and him falling in love with her, and him sort of really meandering around a lot of these European towns. And there's the movie, when it is focused between him and Hackman, of him being like a cocky guy versus his coach kind of thing. There's not enough of that in there, but the sequences of skiing are just absolutely great. It's only an hour 40. So it's just kind of a perfect amount before it overstates its welcome.
Shorter than this pod.
Shorter than this pod, that's for sure. But yeah, I highly recommend it. You can get it. I think it's on the Criterion channel, or you can buy the Criterion. So, Downhill Racer, a good old fashioned 3.5 star film on Letterboxd. We really knocked him out of the park this week. Next week we will be back. We will be talking about Man on Fire and continuing this
nice
Tony Scott movie series. So thank you all so much for listening, and we will see you all next time.